Thank you everyone for coming to the second Franke Lecture of the fall term. Just a very brief introductory remarks about the Franke Lectures. Barbara and Rich Franke have generously made this series possible. It is a series designed to appeal to a wide and general Yale audience, addressing topics about the relation between the humanities and the sciences, about different kinds of knowledge, different approaches to epistemology, relations between literature and science, and not just that, but many other things. So we're very grateful to Barbara and Rich Franke for that generosity and that thoughtfulness, and that's why we're here. So welcome everyone to the second lecture for the Franke Seminar for this fall term. Today we are honored and delighted to have Ross Posnock, who is Garbedian Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. Professor Posnock's books include Henry James and the Problem of Robert Browning. Then after that, The Trial of Curiosity, Henry James, William James, and the Challenge of Modernity. That was from Oxford in 1991. That book is generally thought to be the single best work out there on the brothers James. And if you're interested in the relation between Henry and William, you should look at Ross's book, The Trial of Curiosity. It's an excellent book. He's also the author of Color and Culture, Black Writers and the Making of the Modern Intellectual from Harvard in 1998, and most recently the author of Philip Roth's Rude Truth, The Art of Immaturity. That's from Princeton, 2006. The title's Rude Truth may echo for some of you a line from Emerson's Self-Reliance, I ought to walk upright and vital and speak the rude truth in all ways. Am I right in this?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So that's an appropriately Emersonian echo in the title of one of Ross's books. Ross is also the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Ralph Waldo Ellison, editor 2005, and he also edits the series Cambridge Studies in American Literature and Culture. He is on the editorial board of Raritan and American Literary History. In 1994, Professor Posnock was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, and in 2009 he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also a regular contributor of essays and reviews to The Nation and The New Republic. Posnock is currently at work on a book about writers, artists, and philosophers who renunciate or renounce some aspect of their lives, among them Emerson and Nietzsche, but many others, spanning the visual arts and music and philosophy and prose. The talk he will give tonight, which I'm going to assume is to some extent stemming from the recent work on renunciation and renunciators, or is
a bit,
a bit.
Certainly starts.
Okay, is called On the Pleasures of Self-Misunderstanding, How One Becomes What One Is in Nietzsche and Emerson. Please join me in welcoming Ross Posnock.
Thanks very much, Professor Grimstad, for the invitation. I want to start with two interlocking facts about Emerson and his avid admirer, Nietzsche. The first is the biographical fact of renunciation. They both quit soul-killing institutions, citadels of conformity and formalism. And the second fact is a shared commitment to enlarging philosophy beyond simply the intellectual labor that produces sermons and articles and books. Renunciation is the pivot by which each man brings life and work together in a dynamic unity. Such continuity makes them akin to the ancients, for whom philosophy was a way of life rather than a compartmentalized subject matter. This is the consuming interest of Pierre Hadot, the great French historian. In my paper's second part, I'll heed the imperative to bring life and work together and give an account of that unity from my own experience. To maximize the urgency of abandoning one's sterile profession, Emerson and Nietzsche construct a sturdy dichotomy of life versus books that is as simplistic and contradictory as it is inspiring. They, in effect, sacrifice intellectual subtlety on the altar of life's exigencies. In short, the dichotomy is catalytic. It functions above all as a way to produce the emotional momentum needed to renounce, or to use an Emersonian word, to make a transition from institutional affiliation, for Emerson, the Unitarian ministry, for Nietzsche, a university department of classical languages. the move to a less disciplinary place where a genius, whom Nietzsche defines as he who wants to augment nature with new living nature, might thrive. End quote. The very last place that thriving would occur is in an academic chair, where, as Nietzsche says, one is obligated to think in public about predetermined subjects at predetermined hours. And he says this makes philosophical thought, quote, emasculated from the first. So he wasn't long for the academy. His strategy is a counter-strategy to, quote, educate ourselves against our age. He seeks liberating philosophical exemplars, men of genius, those of, quote, unconstrained and unhampered natural being, whose books are less intellectual than, quote, physiological experiences that produce, quote, the magical outpouring of the inner strength of one natural creature onto another. Reading Schopenhauer produced this rapturous exchange, yet its very medium robbed it of full power. Nietzsche informs us, but I had discovered him only in the form of a book, and that was a great deficiency. So I strove all the harder to see through the book and to imagine the living man. Just as William James, upon whose infant form Emerson bestowed a blessing, according to James family lore, just as William James in 1907 will urge his auditors to, quote, return to life and not let his lecture, quote, teach the lesson, he urges us to be deafened to talk, he says, James. Nietzsche esteems what the book cannot encompass, the outward life in its corporeal presence, what he calls the, quote, courageous visibility of the philosophical life. This is egregiously absent in Germany, where Kant, this is Nietzsche's favorite example, clung to his university, submitted himself to its regulations, and his example produced only, quote, professorial philosophy and professors. Quote, Kant has had a living and life-transforming influence on only a very few men. End quote. What counts for Nietzsche is to abandon that half-life in the academy and achieve courageous visibility, a quality inherited from the ancient Greeks, who taught, according to Nietzsche, through their very bearing, through what they wore and what they ate, and their morals, rather than by what they said, let alone by what they wrote. So Diogenes the Cynic, for instance, is a great favorite example for Nietzsche, a disturbing thinker who he actually links to Emerson. The thinker's physical bearing, embodied in, quote, every glance and every gesture, expresses the fused unity of body and spirit, and this insistence on life as a whole undergirds their commitment to visibility and counts as their most valuable teaching. Although Nietzsche taught for a decade in the comparatively free-thinking environment of Basel, Switzerland, Nietzsche in 1879 left the university and left the invisibility of his professorship in Greek language and literature with its heavy teaching load, and that was burdening his always precarious health. Thanks in part to a generous yearly pension from the university, he never needed another job, thus fulfilling what he called his public promise made 5 years earlier in Schopenhauer as educator, from which the above quotations derive. In this essay, Nietzsche twice quotes from Emerson's circles to inspire his own effort of emancipation from the shackles of professional philosophy. And he anticipates the opening of William James's pragmatism, which mocks, quote, the refinement and rationalism that insulates, sterilizes classroom philosophy. They're all very much of a piece, William James, Nietzsche, and Emerson about this. Nietzsche declares, quote, and this again is very Jamesian, the only critique of a philosophy that is possible and that proves something in the academy is namely trying to see whether one can live in accordance with it. That's never been taught. All that's ever been taught is a critique of words by means of other words. End quote. To escape the closed circuit of language, Nietzsche embraces life and will consign books for the scholar's idle times, to borrow Emerson's famously perverse phrase in The American Scholar. But the animus against the bookish grows deeper, as Nietzsche makes clear. A philosopher, he says, is not merely a great thinker, but also a real human being. And when did a scholar ever become a real human being? So this is the severity of Nietzsche's animus. Again, it's somewhat theatrical, I think. Emerson posed the same question about preachers. Who can forget his portrait in Divinity School address of the preacher who sorely tempted, Emerson says, to say, I would go to church no more. This is a famous passage you might know. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real, the preacher merely spectral. And the eye felt the sad contrast in looking at him, and then out of the window behind him into the beautiful meteor of the snow. The preacher had lived in vain. He had not one word intimating that he had laughed or wept, was married or in love. If he'd ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it. End quote. 1838, the same year as this address to the Harvard divinity students, is when Emerson fills his notebooks with discontent about being a preacher. Just for the record, in 1832, he had resigned the ministry of Boston's Second Church, but lately had agreed to preach each Sunday at the East Lexington Church, so he was still in touch with that. Apparent from the notebooks is that Emerson's second resignation from the Unitarian Church is above all a dispute over language. He's frustrated at the strictures the ministry places on the way language is to be used in the pulpit. To renounce the church is to renounce its approved mode of preaching, language in the service of the formulaic, that is, language wholly indifferent to the task Emerson comes to see as crucial, finding ways to write and speak sentences that approximate the volatility that courses through nature and human being. His journal entries from near this time of about 1838, quitting, they're at once blunt and intricate. Quote, I hate goodies. I hate goodness that preaches. Goodness that preaches undoes itself. A little electricity of virtue lurks here and there in kitchens and among the obscure, chiefly women, and it flashes out occasional light and makes the existence of the thing still credible. Goodies make us very bad. We will almost sin to spite them. True to the perverse pulse of life, paraded goodness sparks in spectators its opposite, desire to sin. That's basically Emerson's logic here. Emerson reprises his contempt for what he earlier derided as, quote, official goodness, preordained, self-advertised virtue that distracts us from noting unscripted outcroppings of actual virtue in class and gender precincts out of bourgeois bounds. Quote, goodness that preaches undoes itself, meaning it logically negates itself. But Emerson's imagery of an electric charge inherent in or part of something that flashes out with light in a sort of involuntary natural process helps solve the logical problem he set up for himself in defining goodness as self-contained. If goodness or virtue exists in itself and silently, how could you ever know it's there? Virtue or goodness, if it's to be communicated, has to be done so involuntarily, as a natural force like electricity. It does exist without being known, and that's proved by the incalculable way in which it comes to be present. He states, quote, I find in me no enthusiasm, no resources for the instruction and guidance of the people when they shall discover that their present guides are blind. This is a notebook remark. He continues, this convention of education is cold. I hate preaching, whether in pulpits or teachers' meetings. Preaching is a pledge, and I wish to say what I think and feel today with the proviso that tomorrow perhaps I shall contradict it all. Preaching is lifeless because it stymies the very rhythm of life, to be sliding in his word, not fixed, teeming with excess and opposites, dualities and contradiction. Depending on fixity and coherence, instruction and guide us, repress and simplify, thereby seducing congregants into obedience, sapping their capacity to think for themselves. And the same penalty afflicts he who dispenses guidance. It is a pledge whose cost is too high, diminished responsibility and responsiveness in the present. He notes, I always find that my views chill or shock people. And no wonder, for in setting words in motion, they as if generate the electric charge he's talking about. Quote, the shock, whereas in contrast, a minister, he says, nowadays is plainest prose, the prose of prose. So the moralizing drone of, quote, odious religion extols a vacuous goodness for Emerson. Again, this is all carefully set up for his departure. The severance from received ideas that Emerson and Nietzsche offer is an ordeal by fire. Each author writes texts that undermine their own authority and the reader's reliance on that authority. Let me put it this way. They seek to induce a renunciation in the reader that mimes the renunciation that first brings the text into being. When he says, for instance, I unsettle all things, Emerson can be understood as speaking of a will to severance that spreads from the church ministry to the reader's dependency on him. Nietzsche, too, values what unsettles for him, the capacity of what he calls being perplexed, and this is he says is the origin of philosophy, not simply wonder, the ancient basis of philosophy, but being perplexed is essential for encouraging critical thought. The commitment to unsettlement, losing one's bearings, is therapeutic, a means of inducing change, a return to life, a William James phrase, rather than an abiding with books. But the return is to a life stripped of a governing hierarchy. Mind no longer precedes and defines experience, but instead grasps what Heidegger calls the, quote, unthought background of thought, the non-conceptual receptivity and feeling that's under the radar of cognition, blind, intuitive, tacit, as when, quote, we do something without knowing how or why, the famous phrase to describe Emerson's notion of abandonment or transition, which is analogous to what Nietzsche calls the innocence of becoming. These are zones of the inarticulable where doing without knowing prevails, and we must trust our own feelings. Left on their own by disorienting, renunciating texts, untethered readers face an uneasy emancipation. At this point, I want to take seriously their injunctions to renounce the book and return to life, to be left on my own, to exhibit, if not exactly a courageous visibility, then at least to turn mildly autobiographical. I want to show how both writers, in their shared devotion to exposing the limits of rational deliberation, helped illuminate a perplexity or opacity in my own life. And in so doing, they sharpened my frustration with the pervasive rationalism of our most prestigious intellectual paradigm, postmodernism. In sum, here is my testimony to the, quote, living and life-transforming influence that Emerson and Nietzsche both seek. Perhaps like me, you have a propensity to collect books without quite knowing why. Over the years, I've piled up volumes by and about, say, Wittgenstein, Hannah Arendt, George Santayana, Philip Roth, Ad Reinhardt, Philip Guston, Franz Rosenzweig, Penelope Fitzgerald, Philip Rieff, a motley crew, and not only not read them, but did not have any desire to read them. I was busy working on other things, and for a decade or two, they simply gathered dust on my shelves. But then inevitably, I would be drawn to these nearly forgotten volumes, and strangely, they would prove pivotal to a new project. I recall, for instance, that Santayana ascended literally from the obscurity of a low shelf to earn a chapter in my book on William and Henry James. Wittgenstein made an analogous, if more circuitous, journey from the shadows, waiting untouched until 5 years ago when I kept a long-held inner vow to read another languishing tome, one that had stared me down so often it had acquired an aura of intimidation, Stanley Cavell's The Claim of Reason, Wittgenstein's Skepticism, Morality, and Tragedy. It was indeed intimidating, but also inspiring. That experience opened the door to more Cavell and to deeper engagements with Emerson and to Wittgenstein, who joined the Sage of Concord, and Nietzsche as a figure in a current project mentioned in the introduction on artists and philosophers and writers who renounced their careers. The peculiarities of my manner of book buying, the absence of full consciousness and the long gap between acquisition and reading, puts me in mind of Walter Benjamin's famous essay, Unpacking My Library. It starts with the premise that, quote, every passion borders on the chaotic, and finds that the passion of the book collector unleashes a chaos of memories, where in each purchase, says Benjamin, chance and fate, end quote, seem to jostle against one another. Benjamin speaks of his library as the, quote, accustomed confusion of these books. For what else is this collection but a disorder to which habit has accommodated itself to such an extent that it can appear as order? For decades, the chaos of my own book collecting was a form of disorder that blurred agency and intuition, chance and fate. And though this disorder helped shape my intellectual life, it had been masked by habit and so escaped my reflective notice. That is, until a recent encounter with a passage from Nietzsche helped shed light. But before that, something else intervened to nudge me to interrogate my habit. Around 2002, when I decided to write a book on Philip Roth, I had at hand most of his novels, having dutifully acquired them over the years and, true to form, remaining largely indifferent to reading them. So they were just sitting there. But as I burrowed into Roth's work, however, I grew aware of his close friendship with the painter Philip Guston, a relationship that had become basic to my understanding of what I was then calling Roth's aesthetics of immaturity. That understanding was built on what was also somehow at hand, a pile of monographs and articles on the painter Philip Guston that I had carefully, if inexplicably, been gathering over years. Now they were no longer inert objects, but palpable presences. Both this patient stack of Roth and Guston material had undergone a transformation that now struck me as more than a serendipitous accident. For the first time, I wondered what was going on. How did I explain my thoughtless buying and deferred reading? What game was my unconscious playing? It seemed to be busily working subliminally, as if behind my mind's back, replacing deliberate effort with intuition or instinct in order to quicken receptivity, keeping me in a period of prolonged incubation as I filled my shelves in advance of my conscious turn to works that would prove crucial. Was it a professorial enactment of what Emerson called abandonment, the one thing which we seek with insatiable desire, as he said, to forget ourselves, to do something without knowing how or why, in short, to draw a new circle? This famous passage, which is the final paragraph of his exhilarating essay, Circles, it had always been a personal favorite of mine and a pedagogical touchstone in my lectures. But who knew I was living it? The possibility that I was indeed living my own bookish version of abandonment, that I had unwittingly, hence appropriately, been drawing Emersonian circles, apparently for decades, this possibility received sharp confirmation last year. Teaching a seminar on Emerson and Nietzsche, I encountered a passage from the latter's autobiography, Ecce Homo, How One Becomes What One Is, section 9 of Why I Am So Clever. This at last crystallized matters. With brazen perversity, Nietzsche replaces the venerable motto, know thyself, he calls this now a recipe for ruin, with, quote, self-misunderstanding, and describes his own self-becoming as a miracle of self-forgetting. He begins by declaring, quote, at this point, the real answer to the question how one becomes what one is can no longer be avoided. The question presupposes that this is Nietzsche, that one must not have the faintest notion what one is. From this perspective, again quoting, even the blunders of life, the side paths and wrong turnings have their own meaning and value, end quote, as if Nietzsche acknowledges that one's self-estrangements awaken one from the tunnel vision that plagues that certain knower. What Nietzsche portrays in Ecce Homo is the coming to being of the most innocent of selves. Innocent is his word. That is one free from ressentiment and full of irresponsibility, his word. A lightness gained from relinquishing the guilt instilled by religion and other institutions of control. Knowledge is warded off, permitting the, quote, surface of consciousness to be kept clear of any of what Nietzsche calls the great imperatives, desires, words, attitudes. All of this is kept clear because they would burden one with responsibility and goals and make one a man of knowledge. The grand words represent, he says, so many dangers that the instinct comes too soon to understand itself and it will be clogged with meaning. Therefore, end quote, keeping consciousness clear thus allows the eventual organizing powers to grow in the dark, as it were, quote, deep down in the depths. A self with the capacity to reevaluate values requires an especially intricate psychic development. Quote, contrary capacities, end quote, must be cultivated and must be carefully protected from awareness of the, quote, secret labor of the instincts. Nietzsche tells us how he thrived as a stranger to himself. This is all Nietzsche. Considered in this way, my life is simply wonderful. I've never even suspected what was growing within me. And one day, all my capacities suddenly leap forth in their ultimate perfection. I cannot remember having taken any trouble. No trace of struggle can be demonstrated in my life. I am the opposite of a heroic nature. Willing something, striving for something, envisaging a purpose, a wish, I know none of this from my experience. At this moment, I will look upon my future as upon a calm sea. There is no ripple of desire. I do not want in the least that anything should become different than it is. I myself do not want to become different, but that's how I've always lived. I had no wishes. A man over 44, who can say he never strove for honors or for women or for money? But it happened, for example. One day I was a university professor. No such idea had ever entered my head, for I was barely 24 years old. End quote. In Why I Am So Clever, Nietzsche depicts himself here as a as a virgin of his character Zarathustra, that human being redeemed from the spirit of revenge and a herald of the Übermensch. Of course, on one level, this self-portrait projects a grandiose aristocratic fantasy of immaculate effortlessness. This is the Nietzsche who was always, for generations, intoxicated undergraduate aesthetes, even inspiring the famous lethal pair, Leopold and Loeb, in Chicago in the 1920s. Rich boys who were drunk on Nietzsche and murdered a neighbor, a young child. Yet the self-portrait, on one level grandiose, also deflates grandiosity by making manifest the self-overcoming that Nietzsche prizes, when we experience the impersonality of ourselves rather than affirming our familiar sense of identity. This impersonality, we are strangers to ourselves, we do not comprehend ourselves, to recall his words, from the start of the preface to the genealogy of morals, strangers to ourselves, is a salutary rebuke to the fantasy dear to the Western male psyche of the sovereign individual as self-knowing master of experience, willing something, striving for something, envisaging a purpose, a wish. I know none of this from experience. So Nietzsche is renouncing the deliberative self who formulates a plan of life, as J.S. Mill would have it, a plan of life, and renouncing know thyself and its correlative to thine own self be true, as foolish Polonius put it. Nietzsche challenges us to bear not knowing, to live without why. In other words, to let instinct speak to us openly. And it also means to open new and hidden energies in the self, beyond the reach of rational cognition that are normally blocked in the act of self-reflection. Nietzsche, in sum, loosens the hold of the Cartesian cogito, which makes knowing subjects foundational. He shares this philosophic anti-intellectualism, the proposition that all experience is a mode of knowing, with, among others, his beloved Emerson and his contemporary William James. For instance, William James's theory of emotion insists on the primacy of the body. We're afraid because we tremble rather than the common sense opposite. It also includes, as fellow anti-intellectualist, Wittgenstein, who says that when one acts with comfortable certainty, one is to be regarded as, quote, a creature in a primitive state, and when one follows rules, one does so blindly. For these figures, as for John Dewey, mind is embodied and experience is not a knowledge affair, but rather is where things are suffered and endured or had before cognized. That's Dewey's point. They're had before cognized. The passage from Why I Am So Clever hit home, for it made sense of my own self-opacity. The passage also made me feel rather heady, as if I was now licensed to consecrate my blind book buying on the altar of the Nietzschean Übermensch, Amazon unbound. My temptation to self-transport seemed not wholly inappropriate when I reflected that, as the Emerson-Nietzsche seminar revealed on more than one occasion, Emerson's praise of whim, intuition, and insouciance seems at times to intoxicate Nietzsche and inspire him to new heights of rhetorical audacity. After the revelation afforded by Ecce Homo, I revisited Emerson's essay Intellect to see if it too extolled the virtues of self-forgetting. Not only did the essay offer more shocks of recognition, but its discomfiting thesis that, quote, we have little control over our thoughts, thanks to the superiority of the spontaneous or intuitive principle over the arithmetical or logical, end quote, contains seeds that flower in Ecce Homo's portrayal of how Nietzsche became what he is. Intellect, Emerson's essay, also made explicit what I had unwittingly lived, that intuition, according to Emerson, is a, quote, taking in stride that has a complex temporality. since in Emerson's version of intuition, quote, the mind does not immediately intuit what it has taken in stride. His idea of intuition, and hence its strangeness, is counterintuitive, as Franke Lectures has shown in her subtle reading of this essay. Long prior, says Emerson, long prior to the age of reflection is the thinking of the mind. Out of darkness it came insensibly into the marvelous light of today. This lag between thinking and reflection occurs, says Lectures, because, quote, perceptions affect one another in the intellect without the mind knowing anything about it. This explains why Emerson, responding to his rhetorical question, quote, what is the hardest task in the world, answers, to think. This dramatically reverses the Cartesian cogito, remarks Arsic. Here, I is what cannot think, what is not entrusted with the power to think, she says. Emerson notes that logic is not absent in us, but is, quote, virtual and latent within the intuitive principle. Logic, he says, is the procession or proportionate unfolding of the intuition, but its virtue is as silent method. The moment it would appear as propositions and have a separate value, it is worthless. What makes thinking so hard, and why deferral is as if built into it, is the incorrigibility of our will. It doesn't control our power of thought. What am I? Emerson asks. What has my will done to make me that I am? Nothing. I have been floated into this thought, this hour, this connection of events, by secret currents of might and mind, and my ingenuity and willfulness have not aided me to any appreciable degree. Our truth of thought is therefore vitiated, this is all Emerson, our truth of thought is therefore vitiated as much by too violent direction given by our will as by too great negligence. We do not determine what we will think. We only open our senses, clear away as we can all obstruction from the fact, and suffer the intellect to see. We have little control of our thoughts, end quote. In other words, intellect grows spontaneously without effort. Some image, word, or fact will imprint itself on our mind, and that adherence gradually germinates, unfolding, he says, like a vegetable bud. He says you have first an instinct, then an opinion, then a knowledge, as the plant has root, bud, and fruit. Trust the instinct to the end, though you can render no reason. It's vain to hurry it. By trusting it to the end, it shall ripen into truth, and you shall know why you believe. Nietzsche and Emerson shared suspicion of the will to self-knowledge, and their trust in instinct also precipitated my turn to another volume that had spent decades untended on my shelf, Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge. When earlier I described my pre-reflective literary habits as amounting to a prolonged period of incubation, I borrowed this word from Polanyi. His book, never read, long owned, and surviving multiple moves, its crammed, poorly printed pages now made all the more uninviting by thin yellowing paper and a cracking paperback spine, I was oblivious to it. Over the years, though, lured by its title and some of its headings, The Art of Knowing, Intellectual Passions, The Tacit Component, I would periodically rescue the book from my chronic negligence, taking it up in a burst of enthusiasm, only to set it aside, my impulse rebuked. Still too much science, I rationalized, and besides, the print was a trial and the pages loose. But in the wake of my Nietzschean and Emersonian-induced epiphanies, the moment of personal knowledge had arrived. I was ready at last for its central point, which is, quote, we feel our way to success without specifiably knowing how we do it. This tacit dimension, that's the title of a better-known Polanyi volume, is a, quote, immense mental domain acquired, he says, by effort which went beyond the hitherto assured capacity of some person making it. It relied on an act of groping, which originally passed the understanding of its agent and of which he has ever since remained only subsidiarily aware as part of a complex achievement. This was a meta moment so prized by English professors. A work that celebrated groping knowledge, unspecifiable, ineffable, unempirical, mirrored the very groping I had long been tacitly practicing. Most recently, when I plucked personal knowledge from my seeming oblivion at a propitious moment. Trust the instinct to the end, Emerson said, though you can render no reason, it's vain to hurry it. I seem to be confirming that. Trust in feeling one's way informally in the absence of conscious action typifies what Polanyi calls the incubation period of discovery. During incubation, nothing happens on the level of consciousness or behavior, even as we're preoccupied unconsciously. He says the fact that our intellectual strivings make effective progress during a period of incubation without any effort on our part is in line with the latent character of all knowledge. Personal knowledge is the magnum opus of a distinguished Hungarian chemist who abandoned science for philosophy, politics, and economics. Personal knowledge from 1958 has always been in the shadows of a more famous work that it anticipates, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions from 62. As Polanyi's most recent biographer remarks, most people first know of him from Kuhn's remark in Structure commending his notion of tacit knowledge. Polanyi's work, which joined Kuhn's as foundational for the new field, the social construction of science, argued for an alternative to the positivist model of scientific inquiry as unalloyed objectivity and rational deliberation. For Polanyi, quote, true discovery is not a strictly logical performance, but requires plunges and leaps across logical gaps. He says in a passage that grows increasingly lyrical, especially when we consider his scientific background, neither subjective nor objective, but transcending their opposition, personal knowledge is science. Personal knowledge in science is not made but discovered, and as such it claims to establish contact with reality beyond the clues on which it relies. It commits us passionately and far beyond our comprehension to a vision of reality. Of this responsibility, we cannot divest ourselves by setting up objective criteria of verifiability, for we live in it as the garment of our skin. Like love, to which it is akin, this commitment is to a shirt of flame, a phrase of T.S. Eliot's, a shirt of flame blazing with passion and also, like love, consumed by devotion to a universal demand. Such is the true sense of objectivity in science, says Polanyi. So he joins science to art and mysticism in breaking through the screen of objectivity, drawing, he says, our preconceptual capacities of contemplative vision, capacities shared, he repeatedly shows, by infants and chimpanzees. Like James and Dewey, Polanyi wants to rescue experience from those observers and instrumentalists who, quote, guided by experience, pass through experience without experiencing it in itself. They want to go through experience without experiencing it. What happens, what keeps us aloof from things, their sound, sight, smell, and touch, is the very conceptual framework by which we observe and manipulate things. Scientific discovery demolishes one accepted framework after another, to construct another, more rigorous one, but that act of revision and discovery, quote, bursts the bounds of disciplined thought in an intensive, transient moment of heuristic vision overwhelmed by its own passionate activity, says Polanyi. This turbulence of creative freedom that defies, if for a moment, the bounds of disciplined thought, recalls Kant's conception of genius as a force of originality indifferent to rules. Hence, the genius, says Kant, this is in the third critique, does not himself know how the ideas for it have entered into his head, nor has he in it in his power to invent the like at pleasure or methodically, and to communicate the same to others in such precepts as would enable them to produce similar products. Genius, in other words, dwells in the tacit dimension. It's well known that postmodernism has no patience for genius, not least because it smacks too much of allegiance to liberal humanism's fondness for sovereign subjectivity and even some great man theory of history. But less noted is that postmodern theory tends to have a consistent blind spot regarding the tacit dimension and the precognitive in general, symptoms of their more pervasive suspicion of the unmediated, be it instinct, sensation, the unconscious, intuition, the flashes of responsiveness and receptivity generated by the body. As Nietzsche says in Ecce Homo, my genius is in my nostrils. And in the Twilight of Idols, he mocks the philosopher's idolatry of reason. Reason is what causes us to falsify the testimony of the senses. Whereas Nietzsche's naturalism provides a natural history of moral norms, which is what he means by the notion of genealogy, postmodernism makes unrelenting war on the natural. This is sort of in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, Nietzsche was a hero of postmodernism. Here I'm trying to suggest they're oppositional. Postmodernism makes unrelenting war on the natural, reducing the self to an ideologically constructed identity. Forms of intellectualism pervade postmodern theory. For instance, belief in the ubiquity of textualism, certainly the early Derrida, rhetoric and figurality, Demon, interpretations of the ubiquity of all these things, interpretation, Stanley Fish, and intention, Walter Ben Michaels. One result is that postmodern theorists inadvertently reinstate the gap between nature and culture, body and mind, emotion and reason, and leave feeling or any immediate experience or sensation under suspicion as hopelessly naive. Interestingly, it's visual artists and writers about art who've been very receptive to this limit in postmodernism, because visual artists often seem to embody or perform this naivete immersed in the hands-on interplay with paint and canvas. They're therefore, and relatedly, often evasive or reticent regarding requests to stand back and explain the meaning of their art. They sort of renounce that responsibility. But they're rich in tacit knowing and intuition, and this makes them willing to follow what the materials in hand seem to want to do. Whereas literature, as Demon famously wrote, is, quote, the only form of language free from the fallacy of unmediated expression, end quote, the practitioners of visual art tended to embrace the fallacy of the unmediated in their relish of the violence of sensation. For instance, in his famous interviews with David Sylvester, the painter Francis Bacon speaks repeatedly of painting as an effort to record, quote, one's own feelings as closely to one's own nervous system as one possibly can, end quote. And in effect, it was the job of postmodern art theorists to tidy up the artist's naive belief in the power of the visceral, which was grounded in engagement with obdurately palpable materials. But postmodern's programmatic suspicion over claims of naivete has produced a counter-response, predictably, one that art historians have started to articulate. One, Richard Schiff, in his book Doubt, 2008, says, claims for the ubiquitous efficacy of cultural forces may be creating a more pernicious mythology than belief in aesthetic immediacy and naturalness, end quote. Schiff's doubts about postmodern orthodoxy leave him, as he says, hanging. His phrase, he says, it does not entail being convinced of the real existence of the natural self that certain artists may be continuing to seek as a liberating alternative to culture. It does not entail this. Rather, our doubt merely indicates how deeply dissatisfying it is to believe that there can be no natural self and no physical existence at all, no source of sensation that might escape the generalizing sameness of our various cultural identities. Schiff, in short, is tired, he says, of being pressured by the critical indoctrination which trains us, he says, all too readily to expose the superficiality, the constructed spectacle, the mirage of sensation, to distrust our feelings more than to trust them. Schiff asks, quote, to what degree are we willing to trust and act on feeling, especially when no theory supports it? He urges us to, quote, stop conflating the history of the criticism and theory of art with the history of making art. The former depends on what he says is a fantasy world of the general and conceptual that can only lead away from the sensory world of the specific and the real. Though theory encouraged him to be, quote, extraordinarily wary of many of the claims of modern artists, Schiff now tries to resist his own distrust. In his effort to keep faith in feeling, he enlists Polanyi's personal knowledge. When asked in an interview what's worth caring about, Schiff says that we need to understand our, quote, cultural hunger to experience what escapes conceptualization. This hunger is deep in the American grain. Emerson called the hunger abandonment, and his greatest reader, Nietzsche, alerted me last year that I too had this hunger. For decades, I'd been feeding it in my own acts of biblio-abandonment, my intuitive book buying, the urge to, quote, do something without knowing how or why, in short, to draw a new circle. Thanks.
Time for questions. Ross, are you going to take
Sure,
questions?
sure.
I would especially students who are taking the course, please feel free to speak up and ask questions. It's a very rich, bracing talk, and I'm sure there are lots of things to discuss. So the floor is open. You're welcome to ask questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Oh.
Thank you. Oh,
Next.
sorry. No, you got it. Sorry. Oh, no, you saw it. Yeah, I wanted to ask how far you wanted to go along with Emerson and Nietzsche in their opposition of institutional protocols to the freedom of life. And I think that your citation of Waldo is a little curious to me. It seems to me in this respect, because it seems, in the way that I understand Waldo, he's saying that you need to have the way of life has formal characteristics. It's not this kind of undifferentiated, non-institutionalized thing. You need to have school, you need to have the spiritual discipline you get from being in school to have a really practice philosophy. And that just raises two things, I guess, for me. One is that it seems to me that the opposition between institutional forms of knowing and the kind of feeling of being free and alive when you know something that is historically inflected. I think the late 19th century is a crucial moment in which it seems to become possible for scholars to believe that by being a scholar, by being a professional scholar, you can also practice free knowledge. I think this has largely to do with the adoption of these kind of German protocols from the Humboldt University into the United States. So I guess that's one.
Did you have people in mind who were happy professors?
Yeah, I work on Franke Lectures. He's someone who.
Oh, in anthropology, okay.
Well, in literary studies too, in history of modern philology, the whole. I mean, obviously this is something that I've been working on, but I think we argue that the modern philology differentiates itself and becomes a plausible enterprise, as opposed to this kind of classical rote philology that someone like Emerson studied. When it becomes possible to imagine that by studying modern texts, you are kind of participating as in a first personal way in this reproduction of a cultural tradition, and that it's not divorced or not opposed to life, it rather is a form of life. So, in this respect, I think that this is the way I understand this moment is quite compatible with the Waldo kind of perspective on being in a school. It's not just about theory; it's about having these practices. And then
well, you mean spiritual exercises? That's, I think, what Waldo says. Yeah.
Yeah, spiritual.
Absolutely. Right.
But in that respect, you then have to ask, well, how different is that from what someone like Foucault would say about the way that knowledge is a form of practice that is inculcated in us and a form of power, and that is deeply historical as well. So,
Well, I think that's part of Foucault's dislike of what he called the general intellectual. That would not be an Emersonian. The non-affiliated, the specific intellectual is inside, right?
Right. Well, I guess in that, it seems to me that, for most of us,
No,
conjecture that Emerson was wrong.
I kind of agree. Right. You asked how far I want to go. I don't want to go too far. I tried to cue my quotations by saying that they were theatricalizing.
Right.
But I don't know if I disagree, but I think that William James starts pragmatism by mocking classroom philosophy. It's a city on a hill, and he says it breathes refinement, and he's contemptuous of his Harvard colleagues in the department, and he's also using the word refinement to extend to social gentility and their indifference to social suffering, poverty, and he talks about. He has newspaper clips that an anarchist had given him about a Cleveland working man who killed himself and his family from poverty, and he says this is the multitudinous street, the world of that's beyond the university's grasp. This is what pragmatism's going to dwell in, and that Jamesian commitment is enormously influential for people like Randolph Bourne and the 20s intellectuals like Mumford and Van Wyck Brooks. They're all Edmund Wilson. They're all unaffiliated. They're firmly Susan Sontag. Kenneth Burke is a teacher of Susan Sontag's at University of Chicago. Kenneth Burke is a later generation, mid-century version of the unaffiliated. He teaches occasionally, but he helps inculcate in Sontag a adamant, almost instinctive contempt for institutions. I mean, if you read her journal, she's saying that something like when she's 18 years old. I know I'm never going to teach. In other words, I hear exactly what you're saying, but there is a broad Emersonian, Jamesian current of anti-institutionalism.
That puts me in mind of a question that I want to ask, which is, obviously these unaffiliated have followers and students. In a sense, your talk is a good example of not an institutionalization, but turning these ideas into a practice.
Mm-hmm.
You did it, you discovered it, it's repeatable. I wanted to ask you if you thought, this takes me to a conceptual question. Do you think that there's a difference between renunciation and abandonment? They seem to be different.
Oh. Do you want to say, you want me to say the difference or imagine the difference, or do you want to tell me and I'll react to it? Well, I should say that I don't fetishize the word renunciation in my own work. Abandonment is more visceral. For Emerson, it's more visceral, more immediate, I think. The way of life is wonderful, it's by abandonment, to do something without knowing how or why. Renunciation could be much more intellectual, formal. But what's your...
I wondered if you could renounce something without also having in mind something to take up, to announce something afterwards, which would be an Emersonian institution or a Nietzsche and institution. And abandonment's something like to give up altogether.
Oh, I see. I think that either one is never forsaken. They're not blotted out. I'm most interested in acts of renunciation that then become a compositional resource in the work of the renunciator, like Emerson, for instance, or Nietzsche, where the act of renunciation is propelling their work. It's figured in their work. But you wanted to say something earlier. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's... So Nietzsche tells us to renounce self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But if I recall correctly, you were also talking about cultivating capacities, like different capacities within ourselves, maybe to do this. And I'm wondering if it might be possible or rather paradoxical to talk about self-cultivation of this sort that I think you're advocating for.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mean, if not knowledge, at least a receptivity?
Perhaps. Like, if, maybe to put it in colloquial terms, we need to be more in touch with ourselves. Can we consciously work on doing that?
I mean, it seems paradoxical from the start. I mean, to be spontaneous, to be... Yeah, it's very tricky. But it may be that Nietzsche and Emerson are trying to do just that.
It seems so. They're writing to it.
Or with the notion that was discussed in class today about impressionability. For Emerson, you can't help but be constantly bombarded by things in the atmosphere, he says. And so you're always already intuiting way beyond your rational capacities.
So in class today, we discussed sort of the aspect of circles that are limiting and sort of you get hooped in. How do you think, sort of in your discussion of abandonment and renunciation, limiting property of circles sort of fits into that?
The limiting property of it?
So
Oh.
sort of how do limitations fit into renunciation or abandonment? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
It could.
Inside of circles that circumscribe, circumstance, hoop you in, ring you in, rope you in, limits conditions.
I guess renunciators are acutely aware of limits, or they insist on limits. I mean, renunciation could be an act of willful drawing of limits precisely to feel frustrated. I mean, I think the important thing in their theatricalization, what I'm calling their theatricalization of their animus about institutions, is the need to gain momentum to leave. So feeling confined is important for them in a way to cultivate. The way that people say James Joyce cultivated his ambivalences toward Ireland. He needed to feel in flight from it. He was nursing it.
In class today, we were talking about fate as something that we feel trapped by. And I was really interested by the way you were talking about postmodernism as something that we're trapped by, this intellectualism. And I was wondering if you would find it to be a helpful parallel to look at Emerson's, the way he tries to escape fate, and apply that, or think about the way we could possibly get out of this conundrum of postmodernism.
That's fascinating. Is there a lesson in the essay Fate for? I'm not sure. I certainly, nothing leaps to mind. Did you have something in mind?
No, I just kind of popped into my head. I was wondering if you had an opinion about it, or if it's even a helpful.
Or unless we would insist with Emerson that everything has its opposite, and that to embrace fate is to embrace freedom at the same time, and so we could say postmodernism is failing to heed Emerson's insistence on opposites, that things are and are not at the same time. You know, that, as he says, a nominalist and realist, every sentence is true and untrue. Every sentence holds a lie. So the flight from feeling in this strain of postmodernism may be a kind of impoverishment from not being in touch with that vision of opposites, perhaps.
I have a question. Permit me to indulge in a bit of intellectualism for a moment. I have a question about the tacit and implicit and assumed divergence or polarity between the conceptual and the affective in your talk. There seems to be a really accepted distinction between here are immediate sensual, sensory affects, and they can be undergone and felt. And here's this other realm, which is the abstracting, universalizing, the conceptual, the linguistic, casting everything into words, somehow sterilizing the sensual and the affective by casting it into words. But we're getting this. So first of all, there's a lot of philosophy of the 20th century, most of it that follows from the tradition of pragmatism, that really offers a somewhat more complex account of the relation between affect and concepts. Begins with Sellers on the Myth of the Given. Rorty, obviously, who I assume you include as part of this landscape of postmodernism and textualism and verbalism.
Yeah, Rorty would be probably the most blatant offender. Right.
He really is a textualist through and through, but he's getting that through a certain pragmatist intellectual history that begins with the problem of the myth of the given. Surely Emerson and Nietzsche are great artists in prose. Surely they're great masters of concepts, of arranging words. Our only access to their work is through the conceptual. Sure. We're getting everything verbalized in a really kind of striking and memorable way. That's why we continue to read them. So what happens to your distinction between the affective and the conceptual when you consider that relationship has and undergone a lot of changes in the pragmatist tradition in the 20th century? The second part of the question is that what you're calling postmodernist textualism, in fact, the latest sort of developments and mutations in, let's say, post-structuralist thought after, say, the influence of Deleuze, has been absolute insistence on the immediate and the affective and the sensual.
I would say Deleuze, people like Deleuze or Lyotard are important counterpoints.
But surely that's part of the broad cultural and intellectual topography that you're mapping out and saying this is all enthralled to a kind of, okay, so you're saying a certain kind of...
I said a certain strain that's influential, had been influential. There's certainly important counter strains. Probably, I don't mean to describe the situation right now. I would say with the advent of Deleuze and other developments, Affect theory, of course. In a way, the problem's been solved.
But isn't affect theory prone to all the lapses into immediacy and the myth of the given that so much hard-won philosophy of language has been laboring to work?
Yeah, I take your point, and you're absolutely right in terms of the history of philosophy. But literary figures don't seem to worry too much about these nuances. But again, back to William James. William James makes very romantic, nuanced rejections of concepts in his late work. But he does say, I'm not saying get rid of concepts. He's talking about not being enslaved to them, not taking them as definitive.
Vicious intellectuals.
Yeah, but it's a problem of degree. Of course, we're wedded to concepts. But his passion is to critique what he calls the conceptual decomposition of life. Getting back to Rorty for a minute, Rorty is a completely perverse figure because he purports to be the heir to Dewey, and he has absolutely no patience with the pre-linguistic at all. And
That's kind of
so he,
question. I
right.
want to know why that happened to pragmatism in the 20th century.
Well, because he comes from an analytic background, and he didn't want to be embarrassed by the flagrant romanticism of James. So he speaks of try to just shut your ears or your eyes to James when he's, as he says, diving into the Bergsonian flux. It's just an embarrassment to Rorty. But I don't think that's a very rich response to the fact that James is interested in diving into the flux.
Yeah, and I wonder what you would say of kind of criticism of Emerson and I guess Nietzsche from another angle, which I guess from Melville, Marx angle, which is thinking about the bodies in another way, which is the way that this immediacy of the body is made possible by particular social conditions in which concepts of justice and scarcity and exploitation and so on. Would you share the sense that, or when you look at these thinkers, are they missing something important that I think Melville at times identifies in Emerson, and I guess sort of the Marxist tradition, which is running concurrent and not quite meeting until sometime in the 20th century. When you leave this, they want to leave the discipline. They want to renounce the current discourses of their
Marx and Melville?
No,
Emerson
and Nietzsche, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Are they leaving ideas of justice behind also?
That's a very important question. We saw today in Emerson's essay, Fate, it's an essay in which slavery figures very quietly, unmistakably, but not forcefully and centrally. Emerson did rise to the occasion when the abolitionists asked him to join their cause in the early 1850s. And he insisted on anti-slavery as a position, but he had a deeper point, we talked about it today earlier, that he had his own, he said in a journal entry that he had his own slaves to free, meaning readers. Man is timid and apologetic, a dwarf.
Why in Self-Reliance do you give that sort of caricatured exposition of your slaves in Barbados? That struck me as so weird.
Yeah, it's...
What is this tenderness?
That's one of the most incendiary moments in Emerson. That's completely infuriating to a lot of readers, and it's part of his commitment to talking about what he calls my slaves, or in that passage, my poor. Are they my poor? What he means by that, I think, and I agree with Richard Poirier, who wrote about it, that when he says my poor, he means people who are spiritually poor, impoverished, and in need of what he's talking about. But he wants us, in our irritation with him at that passage, he wants us to start parsing these distinctions. Mm-hmm.
So you began your talk with this notion that a critique of words by other words is a sterile capacity to
Yeah, that's what Nietzsche said. You know.
And then you went on to speak a little bit about James. James in pragmatism has this test for the truth of it, or workability of an idea is to set it to work in the stream of our
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Great.
And how is it being, how would it be possible, and what would it look like, or do we see any versions of this in current academia of professionalized, institutionalized academic philosophy taking seriously that maxim?
You mean, does it boil down to making the move from the academy to, quote, life? Which is the problematic dichotomy that Nietzsche leaves us with.
Can that dichotomy be overcome, is my question. And do we see anyone doing that now? Or a good example?
Would it boil down to a philosopher who speaks to the general public?
A philosopher who dwells less in sort of arcane technicalities and more to the condition of man in a way that man can have a visceral yes reaction to.
Well, John Dewey devoted, he didn't theorize it, but he devoted his career to the problems of men, as he called them. He was the great figure who, less tormented than William James, carried on that effort. For various reasons, historical reasons, after Dewey's death, philosophy became very professionalized, turned inward. Rorty sought to emancipate himself from that inward turn, and in some way tried to be a Dewey for his age, and in some ways succeeded. But the audience had already shrunk. He never had the scale of an audience that a James or a Dewey had. I mean, so in other words, it's a problem that doesn't just begin. It's not just about a thinker seeking a larger audience. It's also a sociological, cultural condition that impedes that possibility.
We've got time for probably one or maybe two more questions. Go ahead.
I really appreciated your example about how you felt like your book buying unknowingly was the occasion for your projects. And I've appreciated something like that in Emerson. But how do we understand what are the fruitful passions that we allow to go on without our knowing, and those ones that might be unhealthy, like surely maybe there's not a difference between such an act like that or behavior like that and hoarding. You know, because I have the same problem. You know, I've filled up with books and done that, and then I felt, this has been really fruitful, but other times I felt this is massively unproductive.
You mean because you weren't reading them, enough of them?
Oh, yeah, tons of them. But I just wonder.
Yeah, I'm sort of taking a benign example, my own example. But you're right, it's interesting to think of it as.
Well, it's personal, it's rich, and it made the talk very interesting for me, I'm sure for many others, but the healthiness of that, and then on the other hand, somebody who's collected all these things allow that to go on, and in occasion it's not.
Well, or you could just generalize that neurotic behavior is is behaving without knowing why, right? The repetition compulsion of doing the same destructive thing. So it's just a different part of the continuum, I guess.
But for some people, it doesn't end in a book, or it may not go anywhere, and that's what
Yeah, that's
I
correct.
appreciate about Emerson. But I'm just wondering, can we have a conscious, or you just have to be the brilliant artist who that works out for, and for other people, it just kind of leads to a lot of consumerism or whatever.
Or you could say it leads to a great library that maybe one day you will stop and start to enjoy rather than compulsively buy. I mean, you don't have to consign it to a wasted act or futility. Your relation to the books could change over time. I don't.
I wonder if there's any sign that gives it away. It's okay to indulge these. Not only for books, but other people have other things like collections.
No, it's a fascinating question.
Maybe one more. Does anyone else want to raise a question? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you written about Penelope Fitzgerald? You mentioned her in your list of writers you've rediscovered.
No, I read her novel on Novalis, The Blue Flower. Amazing novel. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Ross. Thanks for everyone for coming.